My entire home studio is 4 feet by 5 feet, give or take, and I do literally everything in here. I do my throwing, wedging, reclaim, glazing, um, carving, trimming, everything here. Obviously, the only thing that I don't do here is firing my pieces, and that's because I don't have a kiln. The reality is that if you're renting, unless you have a very understanding landlord and access to outdoor space, you're not going to be able to have a kiln. That's because obviously you don't want to be evicted, and also because when the kiln is running, it produces a lot of fumes that are really hazardous to be breathing in. So when you're sleeping or just like living your everyday life, you don't want to be near a kiln that's running. And that's especially true if you have like kids or small pets. Also, having a kiln can be a fire hazard, so I feel like it'd be pretty selfish to install one into my apartment and subject like all my neighbors and their kids and their pets to hazardous fumes, increased fire hazard. So for all those reasons, I just fire my pieces at a local studio. I try to transport my pieces when they're still leather hard, and I use a lot of like kitchen towels and rags. I just kind of like stack it all together and take it over to my studio, and it works out really well. I haven't had anything break on me yet. So if you don't have access to a local studio, I recommend going onto kilnshare.com. People who own kilns post their kilns and their addresses, and also how much it costs to fire pieces within their kiln. And normally I think it's like pretty affordable. I think it's like $7 to $10 for like half a shelf or a full shelf in a kiln. So not too bad. And it's a really good option, again, if you don't have access to a local studio. One other point that I wanted to make before going into the tour is that clay can be really messy and also potentially dangerous. If you worked with clay before, you know that it easily dries up. And when it dries up, it can crumble up into this really fine dust, which has silica in it. And so if you breathe that in, it can be very dangerous in the long run. It actually can cause really scary health issues. If you just Google it, like potter's lung or something, or silicosis, you can see how scary it can be. And honestly, even when I go to my local studio, because people aren't the best at cleaning up, it's very dusty down there, and I can feel like kind of like clogged up after. And even like my nostrils, I'll usually clean out my nostrils and I'll see the dust come out. So I think if you're serious about doing pottery at home, I think it's necessary to invest in really good quality air purifiers. We have 2 air purifiers in our home that are going full speed all the time, and I always open a window after I finish cleaning up after a throwing or trimming session. You also have to be very serious about cleaning. There's no such thing as like sweeping or dry cleaning. You have to mop it all up. Make sure you use lots of water, because if you sweep, that can just like kick up all the dust in the air. And I'll go into my whole cleanup routine at the end of this video. So the biggest part of my home studio is obviously my wheel. This is the Shimpo Whisper VL, or Shimpo VL Whisper. I got it from Clay King. I believe it was around $1,600, but it was free shipping, which was nice. Shipping was really easy. They just call you and schedule it. I did have to take a week off from work to be here to pick it up, since they don't deliver on weekends, and they also only deliver during business hours. But besides that, it was pretty easy getting it delivered. And another point is that they don't bring it up to your apartment. You have to be able to get it from the street and bring it upstairs. Luckily, I have an elevator in my building, so it wasn't that difficult. But if you don't have one of those like flatbed carts, I would really recommend buying one. I think I got mine for like $40 from Walmart, and I was able to just wheel it up pretty easily. Yeah, so this is my wheel. It's much larger than my previous wheel. I used to have one of those like Vivor $100 wheels from Amazon. This one's obviously much more sizable, but it fits pretty well in the space. It's not too big. I have it kind of pushed up a little bit against the radiator, slightly away from the wall, but not by much. On top of my wheel, I always put newspaper, just because I feel like it's easier to clean up just to throw away newspaper than to constantly have to wipe it down. And then here are my little tools. I have this little tool caddy thing that I got from Penco. Well, I got it from Blix, but the brand is Penco, and just has all my most used tools. And then for my throwing water, I just use these old yogurt containers. I would like to throw a little bowl and stuff and use that instead, but for now, these containers work really well. It's a good way to reuse plastic. Underneath the wheel and everything else in my studio, I have this clear floor protector. This is really good to have, especially if you have old wooden floorboards like I do, because within the floorboards, you can see there's like these little tiny cracks, and that's where clay can get in. So I really like to have this just to protect the floors and make sure that there's no clay getting trapped in those cracks. And it also obviously makes cleanup a lot easier. Yeah, so that's the floor protector. It goes all the way back behind those buckets and all the way up against that wall. Then this is my stool. I wanted to buy the Shimpo stool, but it's $100, and it was just a little bit difficult for me to justify that. So instead, I went onto Amazon and I bought a drummer stool. This is the brand East Rock. I actually really like it. It was adjustable and the padding is super comfortable. And then right across from it, against my windowsill, is my wedging table. And I have an entire video talking about how I DIY'd this, but basically it's just plywood and HardieBacker board. Okay, and then this is the back of my studio. First we have my tree that I've had since law school that has barely grown. Next to my tree, I have my spray bottle. And then these little cups that I threw. In here, we have my little bolts to attach the bats to the wheel. This Pottery Supply House threading tool to make like soap bottles or oil bottles or whatever, lotion bottles. It just creates the threads on top of bottles so that you can screw a pump on. And then these are the stamps that I hand carved for my Maker's Mark. So this is my mini Maker's Mark and then my bigger one. And then in here, another cup that I threw and painted in the beginning of my pottery journey are some rubber bands. That just helps with closing up clay bags. Above that, I have this little plexiglass shelf that I again got from Amazon. I bought these for my bathroom actually, and this one was left over, so I decided to use it here. But I have these little cups. This one I threw, this one's from IKEA, and I just have a bunch of like random tools that I don't use. Oops. Most of these are for glazing and stuff. A pro tip for these kind of shells, if you don't want things to get knocked off of them since they don't have a barrier here, is to use museum wax putty and stick it on there like really, really good. And if you can tell, it literally doesn't move no matter how much I knock it over. So that keeps the cups really secure. Next to my tree, I have this bucket and I have plastic wrap. This was left over from when we painted our apartment, and I realized it's the perfect thing to cover my pieces in to help them dry slowly. And then I have a bunch of things to help dry out handles on. These are those little like width guides for when you roll out slabs of clay. That's for when I do my reclaim. I attach that to my drill. And I also have like an extra large caliper in here. I don't have that many bats. I do want to invest in a bat system eventually, but for now, this works pretty well. I just have these like 14-inch bats. Then next to it is my tool bag. Nothing really special about that. And then I have this little storage caddy. The first drawer just has a bunch of sponges, my Dremel, and then some extra plastic. I like to pre-cut the plastic and then put it in here just so it's easier. So like when my hands are covered in clay and stuff like that, I'm not unwrapping that and getting clay all over it. Instead, I can just come in here and grab plastic that I pre-cut. And then this is my second drawer. I have a bunch of random stuff, just like these little squeezy things for underglaze or slip. And then also some oil paint that I can't have anywhere else. And then here I have my stamps, my vintage stamps, my underglaze pads. And then finally, in the bottom shelf, I have some standing sponges. These are like diamond, what do you call them? Diamond core? Diamond bit? I forgot what you call these, but the diamond standing sponges. And then over here is where I store all of my glazes and underglazes. So over here, all my underglazes, I only use these Amico velvet underglazes. And then on top, I have my underglaze stamping pad. I also recently bought some silkscreen medium to thicken up the underglaze to do some cool like stamping and stuff like that. Then I have all my glazes. This is where I store my Mako on top of each other. And then here are all my Amico glazes, also my wax resist, some extra slip that I pre-made, and this clay mender. Above my glaze shelf, I have my banding table. This is the only one that I have. I wish I could get more, but honestly, I don't know where I would put it. I think one is good for now. And then underneath the glaze shelf is this little box full of newspaper. I actually don't have a newspaper subscription. I get all of these newspapers for free from my neighborhood's Facebook Buy Nothing group. Okay, and then finally, we have my 4 buckets. These are, I believe, 5-gallon buckets that I bought online. I had larger buckets, but I just feel like they were too large for my space and also just not necessary to have with the amount of clay that I was using. So this first top bucket is for dirty water, and then underneath this top bucket is my less dirty water, and it looks like this. Basically, this is my wash bucket and my rinse bucket. And then here is my fresh clay. I exclusively use white clay at home. I just feel like it's the least messy, and I like to use my red clay at the studio instead. And then underneath my fresh clay bucket are my clay scraps. So this is what eventually gets recycled into my reclaimed clay. Okay, so that was my entire studio. Now I want to talk about the cleanup process a little bit. That I know a lot of people have questions about that, and that was the number one thing that I was curious about as well, is how the hell do you clean this all up? Because clay cannot go down your sink drain That's the first thing they taught me when I took my first pottery class. If you put clay down the drain, it'll get settled up in that little like U-bend part of the pipe, and it just builds up and builds up and builds up, and then your pipe system is messed up and you'll need to replace it. And obviously if you're renting, that is something that you do not want to do. So instead, what most people recommend is using a bucket system, like the buckets that I have. And so, like I said before, I use one bucket for washing my stuff. So like stuff that's really messy, really dirty, has like clumps of clay on it, I use that wash bucket. And then I rinse it off in the rinse bucket. And by the end of that, my pieces are generally pretty clean. They'll like be almost, there should be no visible clay on it. And that's the best way for me to keep my clay tools clean, but keep any clay from going down the drain. And that's also true for my wheel head and my splash pan. Anything that goes in there, I clean it up using the wash and rinse buckets. One thing I would really recommend though is learning how to throw clean. It's gonna be really painful for you to have a home studio in a small enclosed space like this if you throw super messy, because the clay is gonna go flying everywhere. It's gonna splatter on your furniture. That's gonna create a lot of dust. Like, you'll land on your walls and on your floors, and it's just all over, like not a great thing to do. I learned how to use very little water and throw mostly with slip. I also don't approach the wheel really quickly. I try to like ease on and ease off. That also prevents splatter as well. Usually after each throwing session, my splash pan will be completely clean. The only time, ironically, where my splash pan is messy is usually when I'm filming the process, because I'm trying to rush through throwing everything so that my camera doesn't die and also my memory doesn't fill up. But normally when I'm not filming myself throwing, I usually throw very clean. My splash pan is like almost pristinely clean. I think there's only like maybe like a couple drops of clay within there. And I definitely don't have any splatter whatsoever. After your tools, splash pan, and wheel head are all cleaned up, then it just comes down to making sure that you're mopping really well. Bought one of those like spray mops that just go and just wipe it down. I noticed though that it kind of just felt like I was like kicking or just moving the dust around. It didn't really feel that effective, especially when there was like a lot of like little clay trimmings on the ground when I'm trimming something very large or something. So for that, I decided instead to just get one of those like dusting sponges. This is what the sponge looks like. It has like all these little ridges in here that help catch dust and also clay trimmings. And so I will go in on my hands and knees and just wipe it all down with this, and then obviously wash it in the bucket and rinse it in the bucket, and that will get rid of like the really large clay parts. You can also just like pick it up with your fingers if there isn't that many. Once I don't see any visible clay on the ground, that's when I'll go in with the spray mop and then just spray everything down, wipe it all up. And then obviously that microfiber pad, you'll have to make sure that you're like washing it quite regularly, because if you're not, that can be also a problem, because then you're just using a dusty, dirty thing to move around dusty, dirty stuff on the floor. At the studio, I use an apron. I have one of those clay aprons, and that's because I use red clay over in the studio, so when it gets on my clothing, it stains it really badly. But when I'm at home, I don't use an apron, and that just goes back to, again, learning how to throw very clean. And so that's really helped, because when you have like a really dirty apron or really dirty clothing, it's kind of a problem because you're not really supposed to put in the washing machine. So again, it kind of just comes down to like how clean you can throw. If you're super messy and you get clay all over yourself regularly, I think probably the best way to deal with that is to take it outside and maybe hose it down. I feel like that was a lot of information, so just to reiterate all the steps of my cleanup process. First, after I finish throwing, I wire my pieces off and I put them onto newspaper covered boards. The newspaper helps with the drying process, but also helps to keep the clay from getting all over the boards, and so I don't have to clean the boards as much. After I do that, I clean up my wheel, I clean up my wheel head, and I clean up my tools, all using my wash bucket. And then I rinse everything out with my rinse bucket. The throwing water that I have in my little yogurt container thing, I throw it all into the wash bucket. And then once everything's clean, I work on the floor. So I'll wipe down using my little dusting sponge to get rid of big clay chunks. And then once I don't see any more clay on the ground, then I'll go in with my mop and mop everything down. One big question that I had when I was first starting out is, what do I do when the buckets get full? So if you use these buckets, you'll notice that if you don't touch them for a while, all of the clay will settle at the bottom and the water will be at the top. So you can actually sponge all of that water off using a big sponge. This is the one that I have. I got it from Ace Hardware. So in the wash bucket, I'll just wait for all the clay to settle, and then I'll sponge all the water out with this sponge right here into the rinse bucket. And then what will be left is just a bunch of like slop at the bottom of the wash bucket. I'll take all that slop and put it into my reclaim bucket, you know, full of my clay scraps. It's actually really good to do that, I think. I was like reading some forums about it, and apparently it helps like all those like little micro particles of clay help the plasticity of the clay or something. So that's what I'll do. And then once that bucket is fully clean, the wash bucket, I'll put fresh water in there, and that'll become my new rinse bucket. And then my rinse bucket, which is all of the dirty sponged off water from the wash bucket, that rinse bucket will become my new wash bucket. So they'll just swap places basically. And that just keeps repeating over and over again until eventually my reclaim bucket gets completely full. When my reclaim bucket gets completely full, then I attach this little mixing thing. It looks like this, and I attach it to my drill, and I just go and basically just mix it all up until it forms like a nice, super thick cream cheese frosting consistency. And once it's like that, I'll use my Hardy Backer boards that I showed before, and I'll place it on top of that and let it dry out. The Hardy Backer board is so great because it dries out the clay really, really fast. I think it takes like a day or two to dry out my reclaim, which is really nice. And then basically that bucket will be completely empty, and I can restart my entire process of reclaiming clay. Okay, so I think that covers everything about my home studio. When I was first starting out my whole pottery journey, I felt really discouraged when I saw people have these like beautiful home studios, like their own private little barn area and stuff like that. And I felt like very discouraged just because I thought like there would be no way for me to be able to have that unless I have my own home. Honestly, as long as you have a place to put a wheel, a place to wedge, enough space for like 3 or 4 buckets so that you can reclaim your clay and wash your tools properly without putting it down the drain and stuff like that, I think you can do pottery at home. Obviously, there are precautions that you'll need to take, making sure you clean up well, making sure that you protect your floors so that your landlord doesn't kill you, and obviously really being serious about having air purifiers going at all times. I know it can kind of seem like a lot with the whole cleaning up process and the air purifiers and the whole bucket thing, but honestly, once you start doing it, it's really not that bad. And it's kind of therapeutic to spend time after each throwing session to clean up really well. I just feel like it feels good to do it and to see like a sparkling clean wheel-headed splash guard after every throw. So yeah, let me know if you have any questions about setting up your own home studio or if you have any questions about my setup, and thanks for watching.